Hey everyone, I'm Will, and welcome to Willow's Southwest Studio. If you're new here, this channel is all about rock hounding, lapidary, and pottery. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of rock tumbling, but not just any part of it. We're going to break down the different grits used in each stage of the process. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which grits to use and how they impact your results, turning rough stones into beautifully polished gems. Part 1. Understanding the Mohs hardness scale. Alright, let's talk about something essential for successful rock tumbling, the Mohs hardness scale. Now, if you're unfamiliar with it, the Mohs hardness scale measures the hardness of minerals, ranking them from 1 to 10. This is super important because not all rocks are created equal. Some are harder, like quartz, which ranks around a 7, while others, like calcite, are much softer, sitting at 3. Well, when you're sorting your stones for tumbling, you want a group of rocks with similar hardness together. If you mix softer stones with harder ones, the softer stones can get ground down too much or even damaged, while the harder stones don't get shaped as efficiently. For example, agates and jasper rank at a 6.5 to 7, and they're perfect for tumbling together. They'll grind down at a similar rate, ensuring a smooth and even polish. But if you threw something like fluorite, which is around a 4, into the mix, it wouldn't hold up well at all. So, before you start tumbling, always check the hardness of your rocks and sort them according to their hardness. This will save you a lot of headaches down the line and give you much better results when it's time to polish. Part 2. Grit types and their uses. Before we get into the stages of rock tumbling, it's important to understand the different types of grit used in the process and how they work. Each grit serves a unique purpose in shaping, smoothing, and ultimately polishing your stones. Choosing the right grit is key to getting the best result. 60 to 90 grit silicon carbide. Let's start with the roughest grit. This is a coarse, heavy-duty grit used at the beginning of the tumbling process. Its job is to grind away sharp edges and shape your rocks. Think of it as the rough sculpting stage for harder stones like agates, jaspers, and quartz. Basically anything around 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Starting with that 60 to 90 grit is ideal. These stones are real tough, and you'll need that extra abrasive power to break those stones down and start shaping them. However, this grit won't leave you with a smooth surface. That comes later. Keep in mind, 60 to 90 grit can be too aggressive for softer stones like fluorite or calcite. For those, you'll want to start with something finer, which brings us to the next grit. 120 to 220 grit silicon carbide. Next up, we got 120 to 220 grit silicon carbide. This grit is much finer and perfect for smoothing the surface after the coarse grind. If you're working with softer stones like fluorite or obsidian, starting at this grit is often better because it's less likely to do damage to them. With harder stones, this grit is used after the 60 to 90 stage to refine the shape and remove the rough texture left behind them. What's great about the 120 to 220 grit is that it's the transition point between rough shaping and smoothing. The stones will still feel gritty, but you'll notice the surface begins to look and even feel a little bit smoother. By this stage, you're not shaping much, just refining the surface and preparing it for the finer stages. 500 grit silicon carbide versus aluminum oxide pre-polish. Now for the next stage, people do things a little bit differently. Typically, you'd use 500 grit silicon carbide to smooth the stones out even more. This grit is extremely fine and helps removing any remaining imperfections on the surface, like a final step before the polish. But for me, I like to switch things up. Instead of using 500 grit silicon carbide, I prefer to use aluminum oxide pre-polish. Here's why. Aluminum oxide is a much finer abrasive, and I've found it leaves the stones smoother than the 500 grit silicon carbide. It's like giving your stones a head start before giving them the final polish. Plus, aluminum oxide is a little gentler, meaning it's less likely to damage the surface, especially if your stones are softer or have any flaws from earlier stages. So, while 500 grit silica carbide can work great, aluminum oxide pre-polish gives a better overall finish. So if you haven't tried it, I definitely recommend giving it a go. Aluminum oxide polish. Finally, we have aluminum oxide, the last grit used in the tumbling process. This is what turns your stones from dull to dazzling. Aluminum oxide polish is the ultra-fine powder, almost like flour, and it's what gives your stones that beautiful, glossy finish. You'll use this grit in the final stage after your stones are already smooth. Its job is to bring out the shine and make those stones gleam. The longer you tumble with aluminum oxide powder, the shinier your stones will be. Some people tumble for a week, while others go even longer for that perfect, high gloss finish. So let's recap real quick. I've made this chart for you guys. Use 60 to 90 grit silicone carbide for those heavy shaping and rough edges. 120 to 200 grit for smoothing and refining. 500 grit silicone carbide or aluminum oxide pre-polish for fine smoothing. And aluminum oxide powder for that final gleaming finish. Each grit has its place, and choosing the right time is key to turning those raw rocks into beautiful gemstones. Part 3. Tips for successful tumbling. Now that we've talked about all the different stages and all the different grits, let me give you guys some useful tips. Tip number 1. Thoroughly clean your barrels. The first tip I have for you, and it's a big one, clean your barrels. After you finish the coarse grind with that 60 to 90 grit, for example, you don't want any leftover rough grit in that barrel, so it's important to clean that out. Even a tiny bit of leftover coarse grit can scratch up those stones, setting you back in the process. The best way to resolve this? Clean those barrels. It's just that simple. After each stage, take everything out. Stones, slurry, everything. Then wash the insides of your barrel with warm, soapy water. Use a sponge too. Make sure you get all that old grit out of those barrels. Remember, the more meticulous you are about cleaning those barrels, the better your results will be. Tip number 2. Use borax for extra cleaning. Here's a pro tip that's really helped me. Tumble your rocks with borax for about 10 minutes between each stage. Borax is a mild detergent that helps clean both your stones and your barrel. It's especially useful after the coarse and medium stages to ensure no coarse grit sneaks into your fine or polished stages. To do this, add a tablespoon of borax to your barrel, along with enough water to cover your stones. Tumble for about 10 minutes. This quick tumble will remove any grit or slurry still clinging to those stones and barrel. This little extra step is definitely worth it, especially if you're going for that perfect polish. Tip number 3. Consider using a separate barrel for polishing. Now, if you really want to take your polishing to the next level, I highly recommend having a separate barrel just for polishing. Why is that, you ask? Because once a barrel has been used for coarse or medium grit, it's almost impossible to get every single bit of that abrasive out, no matter how well you clean it, even with that borax trick. By keeping a dedicated polish barrel, you reduce the risk of contamination from earlier stages. You'll have a fresh, clean environment for that final polish, ensuring that your stones come out with a beautiful shine. Plus, it's always handy to have that extra barrel, which can also help speed up the tumbling process. Tip number 4, be patient with the process. And finally, oh man, this is a tough one. Be patient. Rock tumbling is a slow, deliberate process. It can take several weeks from start to finish, depending on the type of stone and the results you're after. So don't rush it. If you're in a hurry to get to that next grit, there's a good chance you're not going to get those results you want. If your stones need another few days in the coarse and medium stage, give them the extra time. The more effort and patience you put in, the more stunning your final product will be. And that's it. Now you have a complete guide to turning those raw, rough rocks into beautifully gleaming, shining gemstones. Whether you're just getting started or refining your process, these tips should help you get even better results with your lapidary projects. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to Willow's Southwest Studio for more lapidary, rock hounding, and pottery fun. And hey, if you've got any questions or tips of your own, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what's working for you. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Till next time, my friends, and happy rock tumbling.